Today's lecture dances in and out of chapter 8 in the Marstein text related to the critical museum visitor. And I kind of see this chapter in some ways as the equivalent of when I teach public speaking with what we call an audience-centered approach. In other words, when you are to give a presentation, you are analyzing the audience and then tailoring the message to fit the needs of the audience. The same way in curation, as we are designing our exhibits, curating the exhibits to meet the needs of an audience, which means understanding who our audience is. Now, in some ways, this chapter is, I think, stretching what we might call a museum visitor. I would argue that actually a lot of people who visit museums are taking information in very passively and actually are doing it as a way of entertainment, but may not necessarily be conscious of what they're doing, right? That they're not very active participants. And that's why in other classes that I've taught, I've incorporated works, for example, by Nina Simon called the Participatory Museum, and this movement to try to get museums to actually encourage participation a lot more. So there's more of an interaction between the institutions, the works that they hold, the curators, the various museum departments, and the visiting public. So assuming that a museum visitor is critical, probably most visitors are not. And actually I was with Judith having a little bit of an earlier discussion about television, that most people take media in uncritically. Don't think very deeply about the messages that are being purveyed to them by the various media institutions. And for some reason, unless we really stop, unless you've been on the wrong side of the road for enough times and have been, you might say, misled by disinformation or misinformation, you're not critical of the source. A lot of people take what's on the news, what's on television, as the truth. And a lot of people compare their experiences that they have in real life to what they've seen on television. Think about this. If you have any nieces, nephews, ask them to tell you a story. You'll find out that probably half of them will tell you a story of something they saw on television. That we are, in many ways, we've become a very mediated society, and I think because of the extensive use of media, have become less critical. So another dynamic as a curator is actually, I think to some degree, teaching people who come in to be critical in very passive ways. Passive, active thinking. All right, so how do we encourage people to think critically? And I think this is really important, particularly in tribal institutions, because the quality of information that people get from the institution. Now, I am saying this from a very biased viewpoint. I look at museums and cultural centers in Indian communities as ways to educate not only our own community, but people who visit them about our communities. Because those people who come to visit them are making decisions when they go out to vote that affect our communities. And whether you like it or not, if you're in New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, whatever state you're in where there's a large native population, non-natives in that state make decisions that affect your life on that reservation. And they are making a lot of decisions with incomplete or inaccurate information. Garbage in is going to mean garbage out. So a challenge in these types of what I would call a public education institution is how do we prevent quality information so that when people are making decisions, they're doing so from a place of information rather than inaccuracy. You can do this in museums by the way that history is presented, by the way our cultures are presented. So, in many ways, we are creating our audiences. In other words, we are creating, ideally, critical thinkers. And two questions to start that a critical visitor would ask. Right? What am I doing here? And where else could I be? As I mentioned last week, there are very rarely random acts of museum visiting. Right? You're not just walking down the street and get sucked into some museum door. That people have made a decision to go to this place, and they have deselected other places that they could be going to. So there's a reason. So it's not only why are we there, but what else could we be doing? Because you are competing for an audience, because this is now what we call disposable time. How people are, in essence, spending their time. So it is incumbent on us as curators then to make sure that the time spent with us is spent in a quality way, to enhance someone's life, to enhance someone's knowledge. It's interesting, too, when we even look at language, the way that we describe time, that it relates to money. You might have heard this from someone else, but you spend time, you waste time, you save time. The same kind of the way that we talk about spending money. And time does. You ever heard that expression? Time is money. And that is a choice, the way that we spend our time for the various activities that we could be doing. Now, we also have to understand, though, that it really is difficult to create this homogeneous. This homogeneous means everyone is the same, a consistent audience. That actually no two people are going to experience an exhibit exactly the same way. And they can be standing in front of the exact same exhibit and are going to interpret it differently. Because we come from different backgrounds. We have different personal experiences, different cultural experiences, different awareness of language. So we don't experience exhibits exactly the same way. So you have to think then, what kind of experience in general would you want a visitor to have then? And this is very difficult because you can't get inside the mind of the other. To what degree do you want visitors to be able to interact with the exhibits? So how much do you want them to actually be able to talk to it, touch it, or even taste it? Thinking about how our visual as well as written and spatial features planned to engage visitors. Because if you walk into New York City, there are a wide range of museums there, anywhere from, and often in close proximity to each other. So you can go to the New York Historical Society up on, I think it's 73rd Street, somewhere up in the 70s, and then right across the street's the Museum of Natural History. And you walk into the New York Historical Society, and you can actually go in and touch things, because there are historic documents there. Granted, they're going to be in acid-free, acetate, whether it be envelopes or boxes or anything that's going to prevent paper from deteriorating. So when I was at the Historical Society, I was able to read letters that were written by important Mohawk personnel in the 1780s. So I was looking at letters written by Joseph Brant. I was looking at documents signed by, I'm touching them. Documents that were signed by Thomas Jefferson, by Madison. Now that's kind of an eerie feeling. When you're touching something that was written well over 200 years ago, and that document actually affected the history of your tribe. Now, I had to wear white gloves. They were inside of all of those acid-free, acetate, see-through envelopes. So you couldn't actually touch the paper, but you could touch the holder that held the paper. It's still mind-blowing to have that intimate of a connection. Went across the street, There was nothing in that museum other than the flyers that I could touch. If I had walked up to any of the exhibits there would have been security on me in record time. So within the same block, two different types of museal experiences, each of them engaging me differently. So even thinking about how people move through an exhibition, and I might have mentioned this in the beginning of the semester, that there is this tendency, for example, when people walk into a new building, to turn to the right. And there is a good chance, if you lay out your exhibit in such a way that the most important thing you want them to see is on the left-hand side, they're going to miss it. Unless the person is left-handed. So even awareness of human behavior as they navigate an exhibit is very important. And you can shape that to some degree. And if you want them to turn left first, you actually have to give some type of visual spatial cue for people to know. So ideally, the critical museum listener then is asking themselves, what objects are being presented? So I'm in a natural history museum. What is being presented to me? I'm in the Denver Art Museum. What is being presented to me? I'm at the Chicago Field Museum. What's being presented to me? I'm at the Museum of Modern Art. What's being presented to me? Many museum titles will let you know already what's inside. But still, even within the Museum of Modern Art, as we looked last week, you remember we were looking at how they had it, so if you start on the 5th floor, you're at the oldest stuff, and then the newest stuff was down on the 1st floor. That is a conscious decision. That if nothing else, people are going to see the most modern stuff when they first come in the door. And then they can affect the quality and the age of the material that they're going to look at by going up the stairs or the elevator. And that still is a conscious choice. But what objects are being presented? Because if you're expecting to see the work of, we'll say, Damien Hirst, you're not going to see it on the 5th floor. And if you do see it there, if you were critical, you're thinking, why is it here? Hirst is an active artist right now. And you've got him among the 1880s. Why is he shown here? If there's nothing explaining, there may have been artists in the 80s that, I'm talking 1880s, who affected the way he thinks or did something similar. You would need to give that kind of information. Otherwise, it creates, to some degree, a disconnect. So what's being presented, and how are they being presented? We say a lot in the way that we hang something, in the way that we mount something. Earlier in the semester, I was talking about lighting, for example, and even placement on a light affects, placement of light on an object affects the way people perceive it. Even the color of the wall behind the object affects the way people perceive it. So how are objects presented? Not only the color of the wall, but even the various, you might say, accessories that you can have. Accessories aren't always hardware, like frames. Sometimes they are natural things, like sand. Why are the selected objects being presented? There is, in the same way there aren't random acts of museum visiting, there aren't random acts of exhibit. And any of the shows we were talking about, when you're curating, you're making a decision. There is a set of characteristics or qualities, a job description for an object or an artist to fit that exhibit. Otherwise, it looks like a flea market. So why have certain objects been presented to us? Or for that matter, why have certain objects, if you know a museum has certain holdings, why are they not being presented? In New York State, now you used to be able to see them quite a bit, but it's happened now where I haven't been back to a museum in New York in a while. When I go back, I'd rather see my family. I'm in museums all the time. But there are certain kinds of masks that are worn by my people. They're called hadoi. They're medicine masks. And you used to be able to see them in the State Museum there, the Museum of Arts and Sciences. They were, readily available. You don't see them anymore. Why do you think that might be? Because museums have become more sensitive. And they were asked, can you please not put these masks out? They're not for display, that they are used in healing, and they need to be put to sleep. They rest. They only come out at a certain time of year. If you're not going to use them, please don't take them out. So there are some ways that museums have become more sensitive. One thing that I think for some museums it's really good PR is when they formerly held objects that were covered by the NAGPRA legislation, that when they have done the required things to remove those objects from display and return them to the various tribes, it's a really good idea to say, we've done this because we are sensitive. So you will no longer be able to see human skeletal remains. You will no longer be able to see. You will no longer be able to see. And this is done out of respect for whatever tribe. I think that's amazing public relations. Whose view is being presented and in what manner? One of the really controversial exhibits, I think I mentioned this earlier in the semester, was the exhibit of the Enola Gay. And what was the Enola Gay? Yeah, it was the bomber that dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, if you're in the States, this is an amazing thing. It, in essence, ended World War II because Germany had already surrendered. If you're from Japan, this was not a wonderful thing. So whose view is being presented? Right? The Enola Gay was presented as a liberating, as a war-ending achievement. This carried the bomb. All right, it was a carrier of mass destruction. And if you read the labels for that exhibit, nowhere did it say that civilian people who experienced that radiation suffered to the end of their days. People who were non-combatants in both of those cities. Tens of thousands who weren't immediately killed by the bombs suffered horrible radiation sickness. You didn't see that in the label. Why? Why, it might make your visitors critical. It might make people think. And it may be thoughts you don't want them to think. Nationalism is alive and well in the world. Nationalism isn't just a phenomenon of World War I or World War II. It's just as powerful now. Was your hand going up, Alfred? What was that again? Oh yeah, they were bombing Tokyo, and yeah, they were already bombing Japanese cities. All right, and particularly were focused on munitions, as well as aircraft factories, any of their shipbuilding facilities. All right, so they were blowing out the infrastructure. Oh yeah. Yeah, the massive bombing that was done ahead of time on structures that were already pretty flimsy, because Japanese architecture was not, if you go to Tokyo now, it's entirely different, right, than it would have in 1940. All right, there's a lot more concrete there now. So a lot of the civilian areas were very flammable, very volatile, and the rationale, in essence, for dropping the bomb was they were afraid that it would turn into actually having to invade Japan, and then, in essence, doing street fighting like it was in Stalingrad, street to street, because it was thought that the Japanese wouldn't give up unless something so powerful was unveiled upon them that they would see that it's probably a good idea. Still, whatever the rationale is on the big picture, you will not read about the civilians who suffered, the non-combatants, because it will cause you to think differently. There is an intent. In every label you read in a museum, there are conscious choices that are being made of what information to present to you and in what manner. For that matter, a critical viewer is going to wonder what they stand to gain or lose from this kind of presentation, because there are choices being made between competing sources for our attention. So thinking to yourself about if you were going to be the ideal, actually you'd be a nightmare probably to many museums if you walked in with this kind of thinking and actually wanted to meet the curator. All right, but if you're doing a pre-visitation, then that you have certain expectations, hopes, or assumptions about the exhibit. And very often those expectations are shaped by the title of the exhibit. The title of the exhibit in some way should give a certain cue to the viewer what to expect. It may be the only bit of information they get. So if you were to put yourself in the mindset of a visitor, and you're looking through your, what's it called here? Pasatiempo, for things that are opening on a Friday, for example. So it's not just, gallery openings, but a lot of shows will open a lot of exhibits will open on a Friday. And you're going through here and you're looking for something you want to attend. Very strong chance the title is going to be what entices you. And that may be the only bit of information other than the museum hours or a quick blurb afterwards. So the way that what are the mental images that the title is going to conjure. So, the courtly art of the ancient Maya, which was an exhibit at the National Gallery of Art. All right, just the word courtly, what does that tell you? It could have a strong political sense. What else? Do you think you'd be seeing footwear? Probably not. You may not be seeing attire. Things that relate to administration, political, and for that matter, the Maya. Who are the Maya? Well, south of here, yeah. Because even labels, if we really think about it, America itself is an invented label. It's geopolitical. America and what we call North America, Central America, and South America. Actually, the Maya would have been in what would be called Central America. The Maya weren't calling it Central America. Those are geopolitical words. Those are labels on a map that shape your perception. To show you how much we are shaped by labels. Mesoamerica, yeah. All right, Middle America, for example, is the more commonly used term. But the way, even Mesoamerica, Middle America, we've accepted that we call this America. Now, we are where? Where are we? We're in North America. All right, where specifically in North America are we? We're in New Mexico, and New Mexico is part of the United States. And what part of the United States does New Mexico reside in? The Southwest. I want you to think about this. Aren't you always southwest of someplace else? There is always a southwest. You can be in New York and be in the southwest. You can be at the Arctic Circle and be in the southwest. And still be in the southwest because you're southwest of Alberta. Right? You're always southwest of somewhere else. That is a label that is designed to shape your thinking. Because people who lived here in the year 1200, even the year 1200, it's always the year 1200. It is always a new millennium. It depends on whose time system we are accepting. Because before this was the Southwest, if we're using the European terms, it was New Mexico territory. And it was considered a territory of the United States. Before it was New Mexico territory, it was Nuevo Mexico. All of a sudden, what used to be, or what was the Southwest as we started, is now north. Because Nuevo Mexico means what? New Mexico. And where's Mexico? It's, oh, no, wait a second. I thought we were south. Oh, so all of a sudden it's gone from being the south. Well, we're United States. It went to the east to south. No, wait a minute. Now it's north. Because it's north of that other seat of power, Mexico. Yeah, over there, yeah. That's language. That's geopolitics. It's labels. Because before it was Nuevo Mexico, it was what? They called it El Norte. What's El Norte? The north. Now we're really north. From what? Mexico. But wait a second. It was something before it was El Norte. It was Cibola. Yeah, no, it's the 7 cities of gold. You should know about them because of an important place where an individual showed up. Initially, there were 3 of them. And then one of them came back, met his fate, it's amazing how people think uncritically, are taught to see into little confines. Because this was called, to people before then, the center. Or the navel, depending on what culture you were talking to. It went from being, so we've gone from being the Southwest to being the North to being the center. And we haven't left the room. And we've accepted time because the Maya had a calendric system that last year was supposed to be really important. What was last year? I know it's like only 4 months since then. You might have a hard time remembering. What was the year? 2012. Why was 2012 important? Yeah, actually it's like 12 o'clock on a really big scale. It's like when all the hands are set. Right? That's all it was. The beginning of a new calendar. Now, before the arrival of Europeans, we weren't in the year, let's see, Coronado, before Coronado, Cortez was 1519 when he hits Mexico. The Mexica, the Aztec, didn't know that it was the year 1519 AD. What does AD mean? That's the common thought. It's actually Anno Domini. That means year of our Lord. And in the year 0, which is supposed to be when this Roman Catholic calendar, that's where it's all set to, because BC means before Christ. The Maya weren't sitting here saying, all right, set your watches, Jesus is going to be born in. It was an entirely different view of time and space. And that if we are looking at art of these people, we're looking at an entirely different view of the world. But even then, it's going to be courtly art. What if you were to say the trash of the Maya? You might get some people showing up. I mean, I'd go. I'd love to see what, you can learn more about a people by what they throw away than what they keep. Because you get the everyday life. When I wanted to become an archaeologist, but I knew I'd never be able to go home because people would be afraid I'd be digging up graves. I don't want to dig up graves. I want to dig up dumps. I'm the only person that probably goes to a dump and comes away with more than I came. I got that from my dad. We used to tease him. He'd bring stuff to the dump and he'd come back with more than he left. Because you find such great stuff. But courtly is going to tell you that this must be really important stuff. There is a meaning that we place behind that. Even if we don't know who the Maya are, we know this must be really important. And that's why that word is so important, courtly. Because if nothing else, an uncritical or an uneducated visitor might at least think courtly. Okay, they must be royal. Must be something important. So let's see what it is. It's done to provoke interest. Or a trip from here to there. I got to confess, when I saw that as a title, I thought, boring. If that was all that I saw, it probably would not have brought me to that exhibit. So it was important that they had another little thing that said, this is about maps. Now, I'm a real map geek. So that pulled me in. But otherwise, from here to there, it doesn't really tell you that much. A trip from here to there. When you're thinking about titles, you've got to ask yourself, what is the person who reads this going to think? What associations are they going to have with that title? Ways of being political. 50 years of political stances in architecture and urban design. Well, you know it's going to be about buildings, and you know that it's going to be about the political dynamic of buildings. And you know it's going to be about architecture as it is in cities. So asking yourself about the exhibit you're designing and what is your title telling visitors. You may want to rethink some of your titles if you don't think it gives enough of an idea of what you're presenting. And try this yourself. The next time you're going to go to the Mokna or some other museum downtown for the opening of an exhibit, do some of this ahead of time. Think about what the title is. Think about what you think is going to be presented. And then when you arrive and you're standing in front of, say, for example, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, does the building itself mimic other building designs? In other words, is it similar to other museums, for example, or other publicly accessible institutions, for example, or other forms of important architecture? There was a reason, for example, in the in the 19th century and early 20th century, that a lot of museums wanted to make sure they had your Greco-Roman style of columns in front of them, because it would conjure up public imagery of important places, hailing back to a more ancient history, as you would have seen, for example, among the Egyptian, not the Greeks and the Romans, who got some of their ideas from the Egyptians. So as you're moving through the Acropolis, and even the same words being described, because the Acropolis is described as being comprised of various buildings and galleries. That's where some of these labels actually come from. So does the architecture itself, is it mimicking what you see? What's interesting too, and this is why I call New Mexico a really big theme park. Well, Santa Fe anyway. This is a really big theme park. It's a place where people come. Art and tourism are the main driving factors for the economy. And then hospitality is part of that. And if you were to look at a picture of Santa Fe in the year 1880, it looks like any other Western town. Looks like Tombstone, Arizona. Looks like Cody. Now when you're downtown, what do you see? Adobe. Next time you're driving downtown, look for power lines and telephone lines. You're not going to see them. Why? It would ruin the look, all right? They want this look of this kind of new, ancient Southwest. Pueblo-style architecture. Buildings can only be a certain height. It has to have a certain look. If you look at, if you look at 1880s photographs, there are boardwalks. It does not look, the homes, some of the homes have peaked roofs. Part of the appeal of making this a destination place was to restrict the kinds of architectures and facades that buildings could have. And we mentioned before, the building is the museum. The architecture is the museum. So even asking then, was the building constructed specifically for the collection that's enclosed within? You know, if you go to the museum circle, and whether it be the Folk Art Museum, Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, the Wheelwright, they have not the same layout, but the same look. It's an artificial time warp. And it's done as part of shaping visitor perception, part of the ambiance of the Southwest. And you're the entertainers. You're the scenery. And to show you how powerful that can be, when people want to come and have the Southwestern experience, I've seen people, for example, when I was up visiting some friends in Taos, and people come up and they want to actually walk into people's houses because they think it's a big theme park, like you can go into Colonial Williamsburg back east and interact with the natives, or they think it's part of the deal. So they just want to walk into your house, take pictures of you. It's that powerful. The sense of New Mexico being like in this time warp. So what other kinds of messages? Temporal relates to time and how we perceive time, perceive age of a building and a collection that we see in the museum facade, all right? The facade being the face, what people encounter when they walk up to it. So whether it be, such that I was mentioning the classic Greek design with the columns, having that appearance of an acropolis with the various galleries. The Museum of Modern Art has an entirely different look. The Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, an entirely different look. And the National Museum of the American Indian, which looks like it could be done in Adobe, but it sure does not look like Pueblo-style architecture. But it has that kind of earthy facade on it. What I would love to do, and this was done for so long, but just to mess people up, I would love to have it look space age on the front before you go into the National Museum of the American Indian. Just for one day, All right, put spaceships out front, as installations, and you'll have, pictures of comets and meteors and everything, just around that museum, because it would cause this kind of a disconnect within people. It would not fit what they're expecting to see. As it is, the architecture of the National Museum of the American Indian sometimes throws people off because it looks too modern. And they're thinking in terms of what Indians were like back then, as if natives are talked about in past tense. And so as you're approaching a building, how does that facade affect you? What is the visual impact? When I walk up to the Museum of Modern Art, I still have that kind of feeling of awe. The huge facade on that. And I've lived in New York, but when I walk up to it and it still gives that kind of reaction. Or when I walk to the NASA Museum on the Mall, I still have that feeling of awe. But the one that really knocks me out is the Library of Congress. Now, when I approach that, this is like the brain of the country, right? All of the knowledge that we have is in that building. And when I'm walking up to that, the facade of the Library of Congress, and what is that feeling that we're filled with? But also pay attention to things like a courtyard or gardens or any other types of adornment that are around that building. Now here, it's kind of hard to shape that space, all right, because you can't do any type of alterations. You're going to have an exhibit in the primitive edge. There's really not much you can do here at the college. But at your own tribal institution, when you go back to work for or with your tribe, you may have a little bit of license if you're putting in a new cultural center and the way that you want people to experience it. One of the cases that I saw that really affected my perception of casinos for a little bit, and then I decided, no, I still don't like them, is 2 years ago I went to the Chickasha Cultural Center in Oklahoma. And they have a casino that they used revenues from to build this cultural center. And it was absolutely mind-blowing. If I ever saw good use of tribal revenues from casinos, this was one of them. Another cultural center is in Oklahoma City. And it is a place where it's right along the Mississippi River. Is it Mississippi? Dang, I can't remember. By some big river anyway. It used to be a landfill. And they reclaimed that landfill and they built a giant mound there with the culture center as part of it. So it's an environmental reclamation of what used to be a hazardous site. And then they have oriented the site as the mound building cultures would have oriented their important architectures, which means that you are able to observe your solstices as well as your equinoxes from various vantage points along this mound. So it would be predictable on the equinox that just went by, which is the time of year when it's equal day and equal night. That's what equinox means. That you could actually observe the sun rise, and it would be at that very same place on the horizon every year, dependably for the next 8,000 years at least. And the same as the solstices, the summer and winter. That sun would rise from that vantage point predictably, because the sun moves along the horizon as we move throughout the year. So it was something of what we would call archaeoastronomical significance too. This was built into the site as part of the encoding. So when this is being talked about, this is part of the lesson that people got. You ever heard that expression, Indian time? What a farce that is. It's a different way of viewing time, but you cannot be on Indian time when your sustenance depends on knowing when the solstices and the equinoxes are, because your planting seasons revolve around that. Your hunting seasons revolve around that. And if you're off by even 2 days, you might miss important fish and important times to plant. It might affect your harvest, as well as when you bring something in. People weren't on Indian time. That is an invention. So the various paradigms that our institutions represent, how are you representing yourself to the critical viewer then? Are you representing yourself as antiquity? I would argue that Oklahoma center I was talking about, and to some degree Chickasha, when they were showing the mound builders there, that's what we would call part of antiquity now. All right, it doesn't have to be 2,000 years ago to be ancient. Or are we presenting metropolis and modernity, such as the Museum of Modern Art, the latest and the greatest technologies? Or are we presenting the avant-garde, or the new century, the new look? And we are also aware within these ways of presenting buildings, how are people reacting to them? So the packaging really does make a difference in the way that people are going to experience a museum. Has anyone here ever been to the Acoma Center? Acoma? We're not that far away. You got to go. Take a field trip one day. Visit Acoma. And when you approach their visitor center, it's really striking, because it is this combination of your antiquity with modernity and new century, new aesthetic. It's a spectacular looking set of architectures. It's so spectacular, you don't think it's an Indian museum from a distance. And actually, a museum as a purpose-built structure is relatively new, since the mid to 1700s. I think I mentioned in here where the age of museums as it's starting to explode. For example, in Philadelphia, were the first museums in the United States, as well as the Louvre being open to the public after the French Revolution. And then the building of structures to enlighten, to enliven, to educate the general publics, to raise them up, to raise their educational level, their sense of nationalism and awareness of who they are as people. Museums with that intent are relatively new compared to, as I talked about earlier, where museums were the buildings that held the stuff of really wealthy and powerful people that no one else was supposed to see, unless they wanted to show you how powerful they were. So actually, most museums were closed. They weren't for the public to access. You didn't want to advertise that there was a lot of really great stuff here because you'd get looted. So that idea of it being a purpose-built structure is relatively new, but it's within your thinking now. And that the development of this with our accumulations of knowledge, that at the same time museums are seen as holding places of important human knowledge. So are encyclopedias, the development of the books that are going to go in direct contrast to all the sacred texts that went before. Because the sacred texts are what God lets us know. Encyclopedias let us know what we've learned as human beings about the world around us. That's what museums do. Although you can now go to the Museum of Creation. So you can go and see the Judeo-Christian Museum of the world, how it came to be. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. So you'll see exhibits about Noah's Ark, about Moses and the Ten Commandments. Which is as valid a story as any other. It's a way of viewing the world. Because ultimately, what you are doing is you are transforming space. In the way that you order objects, label them, you're doing either an educational function within that space. That's why you are doing interpretive labels to enlighten people as well as the panel text. You may be transforming something into utopia. Actually, utopia means, in essence, nowhere, but it's because you won't find utopia on Earth, because the way people have interpreted it as this place where everything's perfect. All right, there's 7 cars in everyone's garage. All right, everyone has enough Captain Crunch to last them a lifetime. All right, they're never going to be hungry. You know, their car's never going to run out of gas. All right, their cell phone has unlimited minutes and data usage forever. All right, their pocketbooks will hold anything you want to put in it, and it will never get heavier. All right, it's no place. It's paradise, and it's nowhere all at once. But museums may often present this idea of how things could be, how they could have been, this perfect world. When you do see that, it's usually done as a tool of a nation to glorify itself. Utopian ideals. We may be talking about the power of art in transforming the space. When we're looking at the affective qualities, the emotional qualities of the objects that are being presented to us. Or the authority of state, that you're doing so in order to amplify the power of the state. One of the most amazing exhibits I ever saw, not only because of the objects that were in it, but also the story that was told within this museum, which was also a tomb. I was in Turkey, and I was at the tomb of Ataturk, who was the one that led the Turkish nation to its nationhood as it is today. This place is huge, just the courtyard. It takes the guards at least a half an hour to walk the distance. And they do it, they're all dressed in military uniform, they're all carrying guns, and they're in a long row, and then they just walk like this. So this is going on the whole time that you're at this giant courtyard. It's huge. It's on a hill. All right, so you can see the tomb from miles away. So this is, and then they have the changing of the guard. All right, and what'll happen is when they come to the beginning of that whole cycle again, one of the guards peels off and another one takes his place. So every 7 cycles, it'll be a whole different set of guards. But if you're one of the guards, you're going to be making that round trip several times before you're relieved. When you are at the tomb itself, you go inside and you get the story of the Battle of Gallipoli. If you've ever seen the movie Gallipoli, it's got Mel Gibson in it, and it tells the version of a European or a New Zealander, a colonizing power. That's what Gallipoli, that movie, tells. And the Turks are the bad guys in Gallipoli. When you're in the Ataturk Museum, the Turks are the good guys. And the very same events that occur in Gallipoli are told from the Turkish viewpoint. And so what was seen as a very villainous and a traitorous act is seen as a patriotic and a heroic act. Same event. 2 different sides of the story. And then you can go through and you can look at all the clothes that the Ataturk wore. You know, you can see the pen that he wrote with right next to Judah's pen. It's an entirely different view of history. But I'm not kidding. When you approach this place, it's like going up this giant pyramid. Right? You gotta ascend to get to the top. And then you're looking at this giant courtyard, the guys marching around. And then there is this giant causeway that it is this long, it's like it's this long road that really goes nowhere. It's an appendage to this site, but you can take this long walk. I mean, the zillions of dollars that had to be spent to build a tomb on par with what you would have seen in Egypt. The amount of wealth that had to be expended to build this giant, and that stone, I mean, this is precious stone. It's granite, it's marble. Right? You're not going to find sandstone here. Right? You're not going to find, crap stone. I mean, this is the finest. That was a potent museum to the authority of state. And the veneration of this guy called the Ataturk. And that hill was transformed to being just a hill to being the biggest casket I ever saw in my life. I've never been to Egypt, so I have no way to compare. But it dwarfed anything I saw in Mesoamerica. It dwarfed any of the tombs I saw in Guatemala, Chiapas, the Yucatan. Absolutely dwarfed them. So we look at, as a critical viewer, these spaces are areas that we are going to analyze, assess the way we view our culture or that of others. We will define others and ourselves by that space, and we will project the value of that culture. And this is why it's, when we're looking about the way we shape space again, because we can be talking about values or valuables. Two different things. Valuables relates to the economic worth that we place on something, as compared to values, which are the qualities, the characteristics that we hold important. I just did a little bit of shopping I had what I wanted to talk about, and I decided what I really needed to talk about, and I just threw everything back in the cart that I didn't need for now. And I want to zero back in on MoMA, again, the Museum of Modern Art, because it was, not only in New York, but in many other metropolitan areas, a real departure from the artistic and architectural trends that museums were exhibiting. I had mentioned how Alfred Barr, I think it was last week, the curator Alfred Barr actually put MoMA on the map in the years just before World War II, because he was charged with the mission of making the Museum of Modern Art the penultimate museum for displaying modern art at a time when the United States was the backwater, right? Still seen by Europeans as being these kind of hick boys, uncultured, not much of a history. And it was really important for a lot of Americans to be able to connect to a usable past. That's why a lot of artists started looking at Native American art and architecture. Important architects of the 20th century, including Frank Lloyd Wright, was looking at Maya and Aztec architecture to inspire some of his most innovative ideas of the time. And important sculptors, such as Henry Moore, were looking at Native American art, particularly sculpture in the Mesoamerica, because that was seen as the antiquity. It was the closest they could see that would match what they were familiar with from European and Egyptian design. So there was this need to center history in the United States by United States museums. Something else that was occurring too is that in the years that Barr was curating this exhibit about sources of abstract art and modern art, that Nazism was in full bloom. Hitler was about to hit Poland and Czechoslovakia. He was about to bomb the hell out of them in what they call blitzkrieg. And the years before that, in Nazi Germany, they had staged an exhibit where they took what they called the degenerate art, which was modern art, and they put it all in a huge exhibition. This was one of the first blockbuster exhibits, and it was what they were calling crap art, bad art. And it was art by Jews, by homosexuals, by African Americans, anyone that was not Aryan and was working in modern art, abstract art and the like, was part of this exhibit. And they hung it like it was a garage sale. Entartkunst, that's what it was, Entartkunst, right, tortured canvas. And if you look at pictures of this exhibit, the paintings are, when they're hung, they're kind of like askew. Normally you try to have something centered at eye level, and you want the frame to be, symmetrical to the ground, and it would look like it's hung sideways. They'd have stuff piled on top of each other. It was meant to send the message that this was garbage, this was warehouse, that it wasn't really art. And it wasn't put in a fabulous institution. It looked like a warehouse. It looked like punks lived there. And it was done to send a visual impression, because then you could go to the museum of their classic art, where if you look at Nazi art of this time period by the artists who were venerated, it has this very classic look. All of the human bodies are sculpted. They all look very Aryan. They're all got blonde hair, all neatly trimmed. All right, they're all muscular. Ne'er should you see even ounce of what I would call thankfulness about their waist. And the form of the exterior matched what you saw within. You really can shape perception by the facade. And a manner that started to become the norm, what was called the white cube at MoMA, where it is the intent of the curators then that when you enter the space of a work of art, that whole space is oriented so that you focus on that piece of art alone and nothing else. In other words, it is as if there is this invisible cube that encloses this piece, and you can see nothing else in the museum. So as you walk in, the space is arranged in such a way, and this is where the curators are even aware of what we call our peripheral vision, because they may not be able to put the cube there. All right, they don't put dividers in between each painting or each sculpture. So they are aware that not only do you want the walls to be a minimum of distraction, but you don't want too much of another piece of work in someone's peripheral vision, because it will distract from the focus. You want the person to focus only on that piece of work. And we have within our view as human beings about 140 degrees peripheral vision. In other words, from what I can see, let's see, it vanishes, right? Oh, I better look straight ahead. Here and here. Beyond here, I cannot see. That's a pretty wide space to be distracted. But when you are within, 5 feet of something, that space is even less. And what that white cube was designed and for this type of installation was that within that 5 feet of viewing space, there's going to be nothing on either side of that object to compete for your attention. Those are even right down to those kind of decisions. So they have plain white walls, neutral floors, no decoration. It actually looks kind of stark at first. But the idea is not to focus on the building, not to focus on the beautiful hickory floors, hardwood floors, but to focus on the work. So that allows people to contemplate the individual genius of the artist that you're looking at. And that tends to be what separates the presentation of modern art from what we would see as the histories of nations. Usually when you are looking at museums that are portraying a nation's history, you'll get a lot of objects in a very small area. Even more so when you're in Indian museums, until the National Museum of the American Indian, where they've started to move away from that model now. But earlier museums, as I mentioned earlier in the semester, it looked like walking into somebody's closet and just stuff everywhere. All, more objects per square foot than what we would see in the histories of other people. So, as a critical thinker, as a critical viewer, how is the work being presented to you? And how are you presenting it? Are you trying to amplify the cultural import, the artistic import of this object? How does the way that you order the space around that object affect a viewer's perception?